Welcome to another Eigenverse podcast. This is the History of Realtime with me, Samson.
And me, Nate.
As we explore the history of real-time rendered entertainment applications, otherwise known as video games. And we have already gotten very far in our one episode. We have covered the 5-year period that I have described as before the beginning.
That's quite the journey we had. All 2 or 3 games we discussed.
Oh yes, it was quality over quantity back then, because actually no, it really wasn't. The amount of progressions made in that 5-year period. So let's talk about that again one more time. So it all started, we said, in 1972 with Pong.
Yes.
And Pong and the first arcade game, and the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home video game console. Then in 1974, we had Tank, a much more exciting combat game released as well by Atari. And then the third game we talk about was 1976, Breakout.
Yeah.
The campaign mode of Pong, if you will, developed by the creators of Apple.
So those really set up the groundwork for everything to come afterwards, and made some pretty big changes after that, right? What era are we talking about after that?
Okay, so after that, so this is 1976 when we had Breakout. The very next year, we would see the release of the Atari VCS 2600. And that is the first video game that most people remember.
So is that the one that most people think of, the black joystick with the red button?
Yes, that would be the black joystick with the red button, and the wood panel on front.
Oh,
and,
you have to have that classic
yes.
wood and everything from that era.
Yeah,
it wasn't a true device unless it had wood.
Yeah, that was true luxurious electronics back then. Yeah, we were looking at the old Pong machine, and even that was just entirely wood, pretty much.
Yeah, it looked, it actually did look kind of classy, where it was pretty much just wood and then like one color of yellow and then the screen, and that's sort of all you needed. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it changed quite a bit after in arcades, and arcades got associated with all those bright colors and
all that metal and plastic.
Yeah, all the metal and plastic and bright colors and loud sounds.
Yes,
and really wasn't as simple and classy as the era of Pong, I guess.
Yes. And in that era, before we get to the VCS and our world will change forever, we need to study another secret war that was going on behind the scenes. A Cold War of computer chips that really raged from 1974 to 1976. And as we were talking about what these video games were they were these boxes, these black boxes, if you will, filled with all these different little chips. Mm-hmm. But certain chips were more important than others. In particular, we're talking about putting an entire system on a chip, essentially. Something that would take data, process it, and write data back.
Because before we were talking about the Atari and Pong and everything, it was really much more of a mechanical almost thing, where you had all these devices and gates and everything like that, and it wasn't the typical the way we think about computers nowadays, right?
Yeah, these days you think you put this one big chip in the middle and that's your brain, right?
Yeah.
They didn't have brains back then. It was like a jellyfish where you got these nerves everywhere, and somehow it seems to be thinking, but it doesn't have a brain.
Yeah, and the big thing with the brain was the coding language, right? So back then there wasn't any code. Are we getting sort of to the era of code yet?
Yeah,
more than just zeros and ones.
So there was code, and zeros and ones could be the code, and there were certain ways of getting words into the code. The thing is, well, let's revisit code when we talk about what these chips are. These systems on a chip, they are the microprocessor, and they had been theorized for many years, and they started showing up in the late 60s and 70s, really.
Yeah.
Early 70s. But the game really changed in 1974 when two chips hit the market that would change everything forever. And I suppose at the time, it wasn't really clear what the role of each would be. But they did each change everything forever, as hopefully we'll see. So the first one we'll talk about. How about we talk about the Intel 8080?
Sounds super interesting already.
Yeah. So maybe you might recognize the name Intel.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the 80 might sound familiar as well. So they actually had been going for a little while. It was the Intel 8008, which was itself the sequel of the Intel 4004. And the 8008 was starting to get at a proper 8-bit chip. And
so was it called the 8008 and the 404 because it was 8-bit versus 4-bit? Or
I'm pretty sure the 4004 was 4-bit and the 8008 was 8-bit. I'll look it up. But all I know is that the 8008 was kind of 8-bit. The 8080 was really a good solid 8-bit chip. And it had a whole bunch of what are called registers, which are these... it's basically like 1 byte in the chip. Like you think of all the bytes of data that you save. I guess we should probably explain what data is.
Yeah,
and how we can process.
We've been throwing around bits and bytes, and that might be pretty common term for some people, but it might be completely foreign language to most people, honestly.
Yeah.
People are probably, obviously familiar with the storage of your computer of like a gigabyte, and all that. But what is it to be 8-bit?
Yeah,
because I think people have heard that term for video games.
People have heard 8-bit. So what does that mean? It has 1 byte in the storage? No. So first of all, let's talk about what a bit is. And this is getting back to why I say the video games were invented in the Big Bang.
Okay.
But a bit is a thing.
You sound like you're the expert on the subject.
Yes, but everything can be represented as a bit. Basically, scientists were thinking of the game 20 Questions, and then they were wondering, can literally everything be represented by yes or no? And the mathematical proof for this is very interesting. I highly recommend you read it. It's called The Mathematical Theory of Communication by Claude Shannon, also known.
I'm pretty sure you have told me to read that about 20 dozen times.
Yeah,
by now.
I read that book religiously every night as I go to bed. It's the invention of the theory known as information theory.
Yeah.
Basically, everything in the universe can be represented as anything that can be represented by anything can be represented by ones and zeros.
Yeah.
A series of yes or no questions. Does this exist? Or does it not?
I think people can sort of get that. Usually, when people think of does it exist or does it not? Is it on or is it off?
Yeah.
And I believe with what it used to be were there gates of electronic, the circuitry of it sent through an electric signal or it didn't. Is that
basically anything? I mean, originally it could be literally moving an object back and forth. It could be punching a hole in something. It could be literally a person there who has to memorize a bunch of yes or no.
Yeah.
Any of that stuff is a bit. And then you think, okay, so we can store, obviously you can store a 1 or a 0 as a bit. It's 1 is yes, 0 is no. You can store, is it here or is it not? So you put it there if it's a 1.
Yeah.
So what if you want to store like a letter? Well, there's many ways you can do that. You can say, okay, is it A? No. Okay, is it B? No. Okay, is it C? Yes. Okay. So you could say that that's 001 or something like that. That would be the naive way to do it. As it turns out, there are more. There's a fancier way to pack information like that into zeros and ones.
actually might even warrant like a whole episode of compression and all these searching algorithms. That I think advanced technology a lot, didn't it? Sort of figuring out how is the best way to store something.
Yes, and people are still studying this to this day. It's a field known as computer science.
Yeah, and if I remember, there was something. The case was that they figured out this branching algorithm to do something. They're like, oh, that's pretty good. And then years later, it was like, actually, that's perfect. You can't get better than that.
Yeah, that's happened several times throughout history. The most amazing being Morse code.
Yeah.
It turns out that Morse code. Okay, so the amount of zeros, when I said, okay, is it A? No. Is it B? No. Is it C? Yes. We kind of wasted some yes or no questions.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's faster to say, okay, is it M or above? No. Okay, is it C or above?
Mm-hmm.
And the amount of times you have to ask a question, a yes or no question, that's called the entropy of the system.
Mm-hmm.
So it turns out that Morse code is so efficient and so quick, and you have to hit that little tappy thing that you hit to make the Morse code so little times that it's actually almost the minimum entropy that it could possibly be.
That's pretty crazy.
Especially considering it was made like 200 years ago, way before people had thought about computers.
Yeah. So, do you think it was just pure coincidence, or was there some sort of mathematical thing, or just...
Well, I mean, by trial and error, he wanted something that was fast, something that was efficient.
Yeah.
Something that would take less of your time, that would take up less space on a piece of paper.
Yeah.
There's just a right way to do that. And somehow he found it, whether it was trial and error or whether he sort of had a feeling in the back of his head as to this feels right to me.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know Morse personally, but
we've gotten a little bit off topic, but I think it's pretty relevant.
Yeah,
still.
Yeah. So we're talking about information. Information can be stored, and it can be stored. One way that you can store information is by throwing a bunch of magnets in something or pulling them out, and that's how we store information in. Let's just simplify and say that that's how we store information in memory and in storage.
Mm-hmm.
We need devices that can then read the storage, process it using instructions,
mm-hmm.
and then send it back. And this concept of something that would have an instruction set, where now you can talk about programming it. You throw a piece of binary at it, and let's say you throw 1101, I don't know, it doesn't matter, and the processor will look at it and say, oh, this means wait for a number, wait for another number, add both of these numbers, and then send it back.
Mm-hmm.
So something that does that is called a processor.
Ah.
And so as a result, you could just feed it one number to be the instruction code, and then you could feed it some other numbers to be the parameters, they call them, or whatever you want to call them, the things you add or whatever, and then you have an output.
So since you're having to feed it all these on-off informations, it would have to do everything insanely fast, right?
Well, it doesn't have to be fast, but obviously it would help, especially if, as we said, we want to race the beam.
Yeah.
That is, if we want to process things as fast as a CRT screen flashes, which is what you had to do back then if you wanted to have a video game, because that's what video meant.
Yeah. So before this point, we did have processors in just normal computers, right? Or was it just the situation was the processors weren't quite fast enough to race the beam, and that's why they weren't in consoles? Or
yes, also computers were very, 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 very large.
Yeah.
Because they didn't even necessarily have like electronic components. They were just these huge things with all these tapes in them. And
well, yeah, I know when the computers were first invented, they were room-sized things, at least, right?
Yeah, they were like warehouse-sized things.
Where the concept of having a computer the size of our desktops, or even more crazy, the size of our phones, would be absolutely ludicrous.
Yeah, there was a quote
then.
in the 50s or 60s that said, I don't remember where it was from, but it was pretty awesome. They said that by the year 2000, it is theorized that computers will weigh no more than 1 ton.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, they did one better than that in around the mid-70s with these microprocessors. This was a system on a chip it was about the size of your pinky finger. And what you did is it had these two sides to it with a bunch of little wires coming out of it. You put one side basically on one side of the circuit, one side on the other, and it just computed things for you. Okay, we've come full circle now. Who did that? Well, Intel did that with their 8080. And who else did that? A company called Motorola with the 6800. And these are the two that we're going to look at because these two kicked off this microchip Cold War that we're about to talk about.
Yeah, and it seems like it's not quite the same of Atari and Magnavox, where you've never heard of Magnavox, but everybody knows Atari.
Yeah,
people know of both Intel and Motorola.
Yeah, and those are still forces today, although we don't really think of Motorola as making video game chips.
No.
I don't know. Well, I don't know. We'll get to AMD later, but yeah. Yeah.
They came what, 75, 77?
yeah, pretty much.
I was joking. I was expecting like the 90s. But usually with all these companies, they really do come way earlier than you expect.
Yeah. Yeah. AMD basically made their own version of the 8080, and then Intel kind of hired them to keep doing it. We'll get to that.
That sounds like a pretty humorous situation.
It was very humorous, especially looking at it now. But basically, right now, let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We got this 8080 chip, which is way too expensive. We're talking like $800 in 70s money.
Yeah.
So we're talking like thousands, and if not like tens of thousands. And the 6800 was also too expensive. We're talking more like $200.
So it's a step, it's a step in the right direction. But
yeah,
still with that,
step,
not.
Yeah,
it's a barrier into entry into the world of gaming.
Yeah, and they didn't want to. A lot of these big companies didn't want to limit themselves. They wanted the most powerful thing out there. They wanted you to marvel at their power. So we have not one 8-bit register, but two 8-bit registers. And so what? First of all, I'll say what a register is. A register is like 1 byte. Back then it was 1 byte, where you could store the information that you're reading and that you could work with as you're processing, and then you could throw back to the memory. So basically the way these original 8-bit things worked was you took a byte out of the memory, you looked at it, you did something to it, and then you put it back. And if you had multiple registers, then you had more space to work with, literally on your processor. You could be working with this number over here and this number over here, and then you could add them together later. Back then, so people were trying to see how many registers they could add.
Just, I mean, that's sort of like with, the consoles and everything, a race to see who's the most powerful and who have the best graphics and all that kind of, things. You have the PC master race of, I have the super awesome graphics card that's absolutely overkilled. Can't wait to play Minecraft on it.
Yeah, that's sort of how my computer ends up working. So we got these chips, and they're striving to be the most powerful. But they aren't really being used in anything. Also, people still haven't really figured out how to hook these things up to TVs. In general, it's like, oh, look how cool this is. But then the coolest thing you can do is hook it up to a bunch of light bulbs. In general, they hooked it up to 8 light bulbs, one for each bit in the main register.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like too exciting of a game of watching a couple light bulbs turn on and off.
Like, what number can you add to this to get the leftmost light bulb to blink? It's that was the extent of video games in 1974 using a microprocessor. But something else happened in 1975, and if you've been reading my Instagram account, you know that I've become particularly obsessed lately with that one particular chip.
Yeah. You won't shut up about
I will not ever shut up about this chip, because history has never really shut up about this chip. And you probably have about 20 of these in your house, and you probably are, looking at 1 or 2 on Amazon as we speak. And in these new classic mini consoles and retro computers and retro devices. They all use this one chip, and it is called the 6502. Yes, the glorious MOS Technology 6502.
It has a household name at this point.
Yes, it is. Tell your friends. It's just got such a catchy name. Mm-hmm. The 6502. MOS Technology 6502. Complicate the matters that there were so many different versions made of it. But where did this come about? Why didn't I say that this was one of the ones that kicked off the war? Well, basically, Motorola, when Intel made the 8008 and they were making the 8080, Motorola hired this special team out of these top-notch universities, like U of A. Oh yeah, Arizona. Go Arizona.
Woo.
Woo. To make this new processor that would be top of the line. And so they made the 6800. But the people who made this realized that they were wasting a bit of their resources to make this thing powerful rather than making it practical.
Yeah.
So they made the thing for Motorola, and then one day they all simultaneously quit, made their own company, and made the exact same thing. And they called it the 65 instead of the 68, and it was pin compatible with the 6800, which means you could plug it in the exact same machine. It used pretty much the same instruction code, so which means that if you could program for one, you could program for the other. It was pretty much exactly the same thing, except instead of being $200, it was about $20.
Actually, it sounds like some Game of Thrones level conspiracy and betrayals of having secret meetings in the courtyard at the company and being like, "Are you ready to do this? You got your contract already? Yeah.
Yes, we need this extra accumulator to be dealt with. Catch my drift. This 6502, it was made in 1975. It was an 8-bit processor, and it was weak for the time. It had one accumulator, which is a general purpose register. It basically only had 1 byte you could work with. One set of 8 bits that you could really work with. And a couple others that kind of did things, but weren't that useful.
This isn't sounding too revolutionary.
No, the fact that it's just the exact same thing as the other thing, except with 2/3 of it removed. And what else can we say about it? It's got one thing it did do is it put the clock on board, which made it much more consistent. People knew what they were getting into when they were programming it because they knew how fast it would tick. And that might sound like just one little technical detail, but this was a big game changer because the most important thing about these processors, and why are we talking about processors? Why aren't we talking about RAM or any of this stuff? It's because with the advent of the processor, you now had what was called a video game platform. And a platform is when you're developing for something and you know what you're getting into. For instance, if you were making an iOS game right now, you know exactly, how fast it's going to run. You know what type of screen it's going to be on. You know what other games it's going to be next to on the store. If you make one game, you know how to make another game. If somebody else is making a game, you can just jump onto that game. It's way, way, way more convenient to make something for a platform like that.
Yeah.
If you're talking about Android, on the other hand, they could be running a Samsung Galaxy, which is super powerful. They could be running on a Motorola, which is kind of, pretty dang powerful, but not quite a Samsung. Or they could be working on a super cheap, I don't know, whatever.
Those Nokia, indestructible phones that aren't meant to be phones.
Yeah, exactly.
Or just bricks.
Yeah. And I mean, sometimes, Android is trying to push, it can run on a TV or whatever. It's much more freeform. It's much less standardized.
Yeah.
But at least the code will work. It's mentioned to work with displays. It'll sync with certain devices. It's still a platform, but it's not nearly as standard.
Well, there's so many variables with everything of how fast can something run, and sometimes that really determines a lot of things. Where the frame rate or whatever, if you have something dependent on that, it might not function.
Yeah.
If a computer or smartphone or whatever we're talking about is less powerful,
right? Yeah.
So you do need to know exactly what you're dealing with.
Yeah.
I would assume, especially in these old days,
yeah,
where they need to eliminate as many variables as they can.
Right. So when you're working on an established platform, it's simpler and therefore it's cheaper. It's easier and it's faster to develop for. And once we knew that everything was going to have the same chip, and that chip was going to work relatively the same way across the board, it became easier. And pretty soon, everybody had the 6502 or some version of it because it was so flippin' cheap.
So it's sounding like the experiments of the race to get the most powerful processor was insane overkill.
Yeah,
and it was just absolutely pointless. And was it just like an ego thing, or did they actually think there was some sort of purpose to it?
Well, Intel was. How did Intel respond to all this? They made more powerful processors. More powerful, more expensive processors.
They're double downing.
Yeah. Motorola started, well, first of all, they sued MOS, obviously.
Yeah.
And then secondly, they started slashing their prices. They started, cutting some things out, trying to switch to cheaper manufacturing processes. Intel, they're like, nah, this is going to pay off eventually. So they made the 8081, the 8082, until they got all the way to the 8086. And maybe you've heard the name 86. You've maybe seen it somewhere on every computer you've ever owned since like the Windows 95 era. The x86 architecture.
Oh.
Yeah. That was how Intel eventually got to. How long did it take them to get to that? 76. It was like pretty much the next year.
Really?
Yeah. But obviously then it was like $1 bajillion.
Yeah.
This was like space age IBM technology.
Yeah. Use it for all the NASA astronauts.
Yeah, exactly. All the like flight simulators and like artificial intelligence.
Taking it for granted all these years, and never really hearing of it.
Yeah. But basically, every computer you own now that's made with an Intel or an AMD processor, all these Intel Core processors, anything that runs Windows or Mac OS, and probably Linux, usually has this this x86 architecture. But yeah, obviously, it took a long time for us to get there, and we're not going to get ahead of ourselves. This is really like the year 2000 once this started happening. But back then, suffice to say, it was out of the question for the games. Yeah, with the exception of another company that spun off of Intel, much in the way that MOS spun off of Motorola. A company called Zilog. I
don't think I've ever heard of that.
Nope. You would have if you were a video game developer and made arcade cabinets in the late 70s, early 80s, because they made a Z80 chip, which, as you can imagine, was their spin on the Intel 8080. And it had much of the same similarities.
Yeah. It's definitely sounding like Intel was just being absolutely ridiculous. And a lot of these employees were like, what are they doing? They're making all these wrong decisions. We need to take this into our own hands. This side of the story, at least for now, seems like they were a force for good of stealing this thing. But in the end, it obviously worked out for Intel. It's a good thing they were so stubborn. Yeah. Because they've had such a huge impact on computers now. Yeah. But boy, I wouldn't have wanted to work for them back in the day. I would be pretty upset. Why are you doing this?
Yes, and that is exactly what the people at Zilog were saying. But the Z80 chip became an insanely powerful force in the late 70s. I believe. Well, we wanted to get at how we can see history repeating itself today. The best way to experience VR, what do we always say is the best way to see VR right now?
Right now? Just the Oculus Rift, or no, usually we say just go to Nintendo Land and get the super expensive, rides and stuff like that.
Yeah. Go to like, I believe the Namco VR Zone, for example. You go play Mario Kart VR, Dragon Ball VR. These are the best experiences in VR. They all run on these crazy supercomputers. They run on what it takes to get Mario Kart VR to happen, right?
Yeah.
So that's out of the hands of the consumer, but you can create an arcade experience where consumers can come in and experience it, you know. And so these bigger chips like the Z80, they ruled in the arcade cabinets.
Yeah.
But people were about ready to give up on home video game consoles at this point, and really the personal computer, until Atari started thinking about how to put a 6502 in everybody's house.
The bottleneck was just money, right? Where a company can afford to buy an arcade cabinet, and then they're getting a quarter or whatever every purchase, so it'll pay off.
Yeah.
But the normal consumer isn't going to be paying that much money to play it a couple times and then have it collecting dust in the corner.
Right.
It's just not worth it.
Right. And there are other tricky things here. So they certainly weren't going to pay that much money to play one game. Maybe a consumer would like to go to an arcade and go from cabinet to cabinet, playing all those different games. But a video game console needs to put all that in your house, which means it needs to be versatile enough. So we're also going to need some other things. We're going to need a sound chip, and we're going to need a GPU.
Oh,
and so
I didn't even realize that was way back in the day they would have GPUs.
I mean, it's not
a very simplified GPU.
It's not like these giant 3,000 CUDA core things. It was like
it had 5 cores or something.
It was like for the most part it just did pixel by pixel, and you had to realize that everything could be stored as a piece of binary information, as a byte of information. So the instruction to the processor, what the processor was processing, and where to find the things that the processor is processing. You really do need to go that abstract.
Yeah.
And
a map to find out where everything was stored.
Yes, exactly. A map. It is literally called a memory map.
I keep being sarcastic and then being right.
Yes, that's the history of technology there. It sounds like a joke because most of them started off. Yes,
it makes sense that everybody, they'd have a sense of humor about it, and then just, this is this because it does this.
Yes, exactly. You need a map to get around the memory. So basically everything was memory mapped. Let's say you got an ant point. You're eating ants. You got +2 ant points. You store
for people maybe weirdly just tuning into this episode. That you can listen to episode 1 to see why we're talking about ants, or you can just be really confused. Or
you can just roll with it, which is what you have to do when you're developing games in the 70s. You got +2 ant points. You store them in some sort of place in the hard drive or some sort of disk. Okay, and we'll store that in the ant register, we'll call it, and then we'll create a pointer to that location. So we'll say 1101101. That's the location of if you're tracing along all the slots of memory. That's like the street address of it.
Okay.
Yeah. So all these street addresses, and there's a variable living in each of these houses. And in the street number 101110, there might be a number inside of it, which is 010010. It could, you get it?
Well, it's sounding like it could be a video game all in itself. If you have to find the little houses and open up and see if the right number is there.
Yeah. That's why programming's so fun.
Yeah.
It's a game in itself. It's its own reward. But yeah, so basically the address or the pointer is a binary piece of information. The thing inside that you're storing, which is in this case would be the number 2, if you're storing 2 endpoints, that would be a piece of information. But there would be So to make everything simpler for the programmer, we use the addresses to refer to other things as well. So for instance, let's say you press a button on the controller. The processor will access that by reading a piece of memory, which is actually just reading from the controller. So the controller itself was part of the RAM, basically. Same for the graphics card. So if you stored a number in an address that happened to be mapped to the graphics card, you would change the pixels on the screen. So everything was just changing in the RAM, essentially.
Yeah, I would naively think, if you push a button, it has some sort of real world, electrical signal goes through that and does something, but it was sort of like it goes and then goes to this memory address, and then it's keep looking up, and it said, oh, you pushed that button, now let me do something. Well,
it totally depends on what type of controller it is, I guess, but in general, it didn't really even send the signal. By pressing a button, you closed a circuit or whatever, and then when the processor was reading from the memory, it would send a signal through and see if it goes through, basically. Okay. And that's how it would read the that's a super naive, oversimplified way of doing it. And it was very different depending on, especially the dials, the so-called paddle controllers. Those are a pain in the neck.
We're talking about information, and a button is on or off, and it's a 0 or 1. And then if you have a paddle, that's depending how many things you have.
The rotation of it, you had to add up the potentiation. You had to charge it a certain amount in order to get a signal from it. So depending on how far it was rotated, it could take several clock cycles or it could take several read instructions just to get a signal back from it. It was just...
That sounds terrible.
I don't really remember enough about how I did it in order to do it justice, but suffice to say that I'm glad I don't have to do that anymore. Until, of course, I make my Atari emulator thing.
3D print some knobs and and go the whole way.
But outside of that, yes, it was mostly just reading from these data points. But obviously, you can only remember so many ones and zeros. Me, I can remember about 3. Okay. So programmers aren't there sitting down writing ones and zeros. In the beginning they were, and they had some sort of code written out on a piece of paper that said, what ones and zeros correspond to what instruction code. But much earlier than that, they had these shorthand mnemonics for what the instruction codes were. To add, what's a better example? Well, for example, to load the accumulator. So we talked about the accumulator. That's the part of these 1970s processors that did stuff. It was the main register. And to load the accumulator means reach into the memory, take a number, whatever number is stored in that pointer, and then put it into the accumulator. So there was the code to do that was an 8 binary digit opcode, followed by a pointer, which was also an 8 binary digit thing.
That doesn't seem too crazy though. That's not a ton of numbers for making numbers turn into some sort of function.
Right. But when you need to do that thousands upon thousands of times in one program, that's going to be a lot of ones and zeros.
They have copy and paste back then.
I think they had to literally photocopy and paste it with glue. They basically they created something called an assembler.
Okay.
Which would take a 3-letter mnemonic and turn it into that opcode. So it would take in something like LDA, and it would translate that into the opcode for loading the accumulator. And then you could give it the address in binary, or you could give it whatever number that was. So for instance, once you know binary, you know that 00010001 would be 17. Instead, you could just write 17. Or you could say you could create your own variable called ant points, and you could say that equals 17.
Yeah.
So now you could say LDA ant points instead of saying 1 0 1 0 1 0.
Yeah, it saves a lot of time.
Yeah, and it certainly saves a lot of mental anguish.
Yeah, we're not just surrounded by ones and zeros constantly and just going insane.
Yeah,
questioning reality.
Yeah, and eventually, when you were doing it right with the assembly language, so what it's called, you didn't really see any ones and zeros. It made much more sense. You saw LDA ant points, so you knew. Load the accumulator ant points. In other words, go wherever the ant points are supposed to be, see what it is, and let's take that. And then the next thing might be add or subtract B points. This ant accidentally ate B's, which doesn't end well for the anteater. No. So yeah, now you could say, okay, take the Go into the memory, you find the endpoints. Okay, put that in the processor. Now go and find the B points and subtract that from whatever's in the processor. Now store the accumulator back into the endpoints. So, okay, see the endpoints, take that. See the B points, subtract that, and now put what you got left back in the endpoints. So we've applied the B points to the endpoints. And that's how you programmed video games. From 1975 to 1995, really. Yeah, because there were better languages where you didn't have to load the accumulator. You could work with multiple things at a time. You could say, like these days, you'd just say, subtract B points from end points, and then you're done. That's one thing. But the thing was, the act of interpreting that and the act of translating that into the opcodes, it was just so slow that you couldn't race the beam. Yeah. You couldn't keep up with the TV, and so you couldn't put that in a video game. Yeah.
That seemed like a pretty driving force for all of video games, the concept of racing the beam.
Yes. And getting to the right frame rate is still a driving force in video games.
Yeah. You can see the mentality has continued forth. I don't know if it's quite as much as the actual limitation of everything will go wrong if we don't, if we're not able to have that information by the time the beam gets there.
Right. You won't suddenly teleport one thing half in one place, half in another place, and upside down and off the screen and put a character in your score display. That won't happen if you fall off course. Yeah. You'll just drop a frame. Yeah. Which is still enough to get everybody on Twitter to hate you. But, basically, back then, And even to this day, a lot of companies, especially these old school companies like Nintendo, they'll get down and dirty with the assembly code. Yeah. And they will optimize everything.
And so you're talking about the assembly code, if I remember. So the code itself was just called assembly. Was that the language? Or
it's hard to even call that a language. It's more of a cipher. Okay. And a cipher is that's like if I say the word I is controller, and I say the word eat is water, and I say the word apples is Dr. Pepper. I'm just taking the first two things I see on my
I don't know if anybody could have figured that out. You were so smooth.
Yeah. Then I could say controller water Dr. Pepper. And if you were in on it and you knew the cipher, you would be able to know, oh, he just said I eat apples. That's not a new language. Yeah. It's just English. Yeah. It's just I matched one word to another. And
it was more of a shorthand, right? I guess.
Yeah. So it's an easy to remember shorthand mnemonic. It's the same thing, but it's just a different way of reading it. It's more readable. So that's what assembly language is. It's mostly a cipher for binary machine code.
And this is just to help the humans, right? Not to help them. The machine doesn't care.
No. And it would have to run through another type of machine called an assembler in order to turn into machine code. Okay. But, eventually the computers, they could assemble their own code. Yeah. So yeah. So now where are we now? We are writing assembly code for these processors. These processors come with these a huge list of opcodes, and we have an easy way of writing for them that programmers can learn. Now everybody. People have figured out that we can put a 6502 in anything. So now we just need to learn the 6502 instruction set, which, by the way, which is pretty much the same as the 6800 instruction set. And honestly, it's pretty much the same as the 8080 instruction set. These things were all getting standardized. At least they were having the same mnemonics.
Yeah.
And so now everybody knows how to program for this thing. It's cheap. It's small. It's standardized, and we've figured out how to memory map all these other different complicated chips onto the memory space of these processors. And so we now have video game platforms. We have these big shiny arcade cabinets coming out like Galaxian and Space Invaders. And we really didn't talk too much about any fun games in this podcast.
This was a really technical heavy episode.
Maybe we'll patch in a warning in the beginning of this.
This might end up being like episode 1.5 or something.
Yeah,
it's only for the nerds.
Yeah,
or people that want to be nerds.
Yeah. We'll make sure to at least put in some sort of inside joke in the next episode to reward you for listening to this. We'll talk more about the fun stuff. We'll talk about Space Invaders. We'll talk about Galaxian, and we will talk about the Atari VCS 2600 that would run, both of those games and many more until finally they met their match with a certain other 6502 box or a few other 6502 box in 1982. We're talking the Commodore 64, the Nintendo Entertainment System.
Yeah, that's really getting into the real start of video games.
Things are about to start. So I appreciate those of you who have stuck with us until the start in these first 1.5 episodes. And but I think we have talked for way too long here, and we had better stop myself now before I start listening to you the entire operation code set, instruction set of the 6502.
Yeah, it seems like, how could he talk for an hour about that? But you have no idea.
You have no idea.
You listeners have got off easy.
Yeah, and but if you do want to know the full insanity of these things, and you want to delve as deep as I did, and to the point where you can create your own games for these consoles, especially the glorious new Commodore 64 Mini, which you can program yourself with 6502 instruction sets. We'll have resources for that, and we'll probably have tutorials for that. We might even have a vlog for that. If you don't know what I'm talking about, check out our YouTube site, which is pretty awesome. And if you're not checking it out already, watching this podcast.
But yeah, most likely, I feel like people are going to find it through YouTube. Who knows? Or maybe you're listening to this years into the future.
Yeah, please tell us in the comments of whatever this is, where you're reading it. Okay. Or listening to it, whatever you do to a podcast.
Reading, listening, they're all the same.
It's all the same thing in this XR universe.
Yeah.
Okay. So
thank you. And we'll be back later with even more exciting information.
Yes. Until then, what's our sign off? Till next real time. Yes.
Till next time.
All right.
Till next real time.